Harry Belafonte, singer, actor, and activist, passed away in New York on April 25th at the age of 96. The cause of death was congestive heart failure, somewhat ironic for a man who put heart and soul into everything he did. Born in Harlem on March 1st, 1927, Harry Belafonte's parents were both of Caribbean heritage. His father, a chef, was from Martinique, and his mother, a housekeeper from Jamaica. He spent 8 years of his childhood with his mother's family in rural St. Anne, Jamaica, attending Walmer's School in Kingston. On his return to New York, he did not fare well at high school thanks to his struggles with dyslexia. He joined the U.S. Navy at age 17 and served at a New Jersey military base during World War II. After the war, Belafonte held a few low-paying jobs until, after a visit to the American Negro Theater, he was inspired, like his fellow Caribbean, Bahamian American actor Sidney Poitier, to take acting lessons. The two became friendly rivals, but Belafonte's career soon turned to music. As a singer and musician, his popular renditions of Jamaican folk songs broke barriers in much the same way that Poitier's acting opened up new possibilities for actors of color. Belafonte's first album, Calypso, is said to be the first long-playing record to sell 1 million copies. This sparked a huge craze for Caribbean music during the 1950s, a significant accomplishment considering the racial segregation in the U.S., when black faces were hardly visible in the media and entertainment fields. Perhaps the most well-known track was Day-O, also known as the Banana Boat Song, based on a Jamaican folk favorite about banana workers on the island. The tune, an enormous hit on both sides of the Atlantic, became Belafonte's signature song.
Sad to say I'm on my way.
Jamaica Farewell, a poignant, nostalgic tribute to the beauty of the Caribbean, with lyrics by Irving Burgee, an American of Barbadian heritage who penned many of Belafonte's songs, was also popular. According to the New York Times, by 1959, the charismatic and handsome Belafonte had become the highest paid black performer in history and was naturally in great demand. Moving effortlessly from music to acting, Belafonte won a Tony Award in 1954 for his role in Almanac, a Broadway musical. But as his acting career developed, he found himself turning towards a life of activism. He became good friends with and was mentored by Martin Luther King Jr. When King was jailed in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, Belafonte was the one who posted his bail. Belafonte was also involved in organizing, financing, and raising funds for numerous causes, including the March on Washington, where King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. More and more, Belafonte came to be known for his civil rights activism across the U.S. Later, he turned his attention beyond his country's borders, campaigning against apartheid in South Africa. A fierce and fearless critic of racial injustice, Belafonte took on many human rights issues, including the Guantanamo Bay detentions, and criticized some black American artists for their lack of involvement in matters of black consciousness. His comments were sometimes controversial, but he always spoke his mind with conviction, a trait that many Caribbean nationals admire. For many Jamaicans and other Caribbean nationals at home and in the diaspora, it was not so much for his acting and musical career that Belafonte was deeply appreciated. It was for his activism in the field of civil rights and as a dedicated champion of social justice throughout his life. A man of many layers, Belafonte's passing has put his legacy as an artist and activist once more into the international spotlight, with regional citizens and members of the diaspora experiencing a deep sense of nostalgia for this Caribbean man and global icon. And now, joining me to share their experiences with and memories of Harry Belafonte are Professor Clarence Lucene, PhD, Professor of Political Science and International Relations at American University in Washington, D.C., and an expert on human rights and global race relations. Ms. Dira Tompkins, a biomedical librarian and cultural activist. And joining us is also Mr. James Early, former Assistant Secretary for Education and Public Service and Director of the Cultural Heritage Policy Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Thank you all for joining me this evening for this discussion, and welcome, Carib Nation. We're talking about quite an icon. So let me ask you to start. I think James Early, if I remember, you would probably have been dealing with Mr. Belafonte for quite some time, a long time ago. Let me ask you to start by giving us some idea of how you became acquainted with Mr. Belafonte, what your relationship was like.
Well, I first became ironically acquainted with him when I approached him on Capitol Hill at a meeting of multicultural arts administrations from around the country who were petitioning Congress to support multicultural policies and arts funding. And I introduced myself with my title and mentioned the Smithsonian Institution, at which point he said, "Don't say a damn thing to me until you get out of South Africa." I bit my tongue and I realized quickly that he was not speaking to me personally, but he was speaking to a broader policy about the Smithsonian's investment in US corporations who were supporting apartheid in South Africa. Unbeknownst to him, we were involved in a struggle inside the Smithsonian, which was eventually successful to get the Smithsonian to disinvest. But I walked away from that meeting realizing, one, that I was dealing with a man of strong moral, ethical grounding who put aside formalities to stand on principle. And I was impressed with that. Years later, I met him again at the Highlander Center in Tennessee, where we were commemorating the life of a Smithsonian colleague, Ralph Renzler, and we began to develop a relationship over time, including with one of his most cherished friends that when he introduced him at the Institute for Policy Studies, where I was chairing the board many years later, Danny Glover, who was introduced as the most important friend that Mr. Belafonte had in the business since Paul Robeson. And I realized that he was talking from the vantage point of a cultural justice activist, a citizen activist. And over the years, then I developed a strong relationship with him. We spent time in Cuba, we spent time in South Africa. I proposed and organized a trip for him to Venezuela to meet with Hugo Chavez. He decided on who the delegation would be, but I had made the proposal. And we were founding members of Telesur together, along with Danny Glover and the late Sal Landau at the Institute for Policy Studies. And we developed a strong friendship both with my wife and his wives, both his wives, the current wife and the former wife, as well as with Gina Belafonte. So I had a really good friendship relationship with him, as well as an activist collaboration with him.
Dira, as a musician and producer, tell us a little bit about your relationship or how you became acquainted with Mr. Belafonte.
Well, I didn't know him personally, but I knew him as the personality he was to all of us. I grew up in Roxbury, Massachusetts, Black community in Boston. And I remember our record player. And every Saturday and actually throughout the week, we would just play his music over and over. I can't tell you that I actually knew where Jamaica was or the Caribbean at that time. We weren't educated at that time about all of our diaspora placement. But I knew this music and this man was part of my story. And so I grew up listening to him like a lot of Black Americans did, and of course watching him, throughout his career in the movement, especially in the movement. He was very close to Martin Luther King, so he was present. He was a contributor. He was an activist at a lot of the civil rights movements. And as Black Americans, we watched and paid attention to who stood up and who stood up for us and who didn't. And Harry was always, always present, visible, and outspoken. So it was much later in life that I actually got into the music business. Interestingly, it was another Jamaican, Bob Marley, who really kind of made me get into being active in the music business. And my commitment to Bob's music and the Rasta-inspired music of Jamaica was that it was politically conscious and aware. So I kind of made a commitment to committed artist. And Harry certainly was maybe the beginning of that story for me.
He certainly put the Caribbean and Calypso on the map
On the map,
for a lot of
definitely.
Americans.
Like again, seeing Harry, we knew this was our brother and not someone from somewhere else. This was our brother. The way he carried himself, his style, he was a very handsome man. He really presented beautifully. And when we heard Deo, we kind of knew that was our song too.
Yeah.
We were very clear. But later in life, I was connected to him through James, actually. I always saw James with Harry and Danny. They were ever present in Washington at all the right political conscious activist events. And so we got to glimpse him then. But my niece, I was really blessed because my niece Paula Witt works with the PR firm Sunshine Sachs. Ken Sunshine is his PR agent. So my niece got to work with him over the past decade and became a very close friend of the family, Gina, also Max Roach's son. And she's been next to them for every one of his life events. Up until I guess like his 90th birthday or so.
Wow.
He staged a big concert in Atlanta several years ago called Many Rivers to Cross with Gina and Max Roach's son. And so I had the honor of attending, with my niece, and I did meet Mr. Belafonte there. And so I was really honored to be there. It was a beautiful event. So, my connections have been not close, but I am a great admirer. He's my hero in terms of political activist and a conscious artist.
Yeah, absolutely. Professor Lucene, I understand you know him very well as well. Tell me a little bit about your interaction with him.
So we first met back in the early 80s when we were doing anti-apartheid work with the Free South Africa movement, through Trans-Africa. James and Dira were, involved in those efforts. So that's when I first met him, but didn't really get to know him. And then later, as James indicated about the Institute for Policy Studies, I also became a board member. And that's where I really got to know Harry, or we used to call him Mr. B. And I was very interested in his work because, of course, I knew his history, from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and he just sort of towered through that period. And you cannot name a single important figure out of those decades that he did not interact with, and not just superficially, but as counsel, as guide. We're talking artists from Duke Ellington to Sidney Poitier to Sammy Davis Jr. We're talking athletes like Muhammad Ali, Jackie Robinson, of course, every political figure, as Dira talked about, from the King to Stokely Carmichael to Bobby Kennedy, all the way up through now. And so, I was just, interested in that, and I just continually peppered him with questions, which he, tolerated. But then he was interested in my work, and because I write a lot about, was doing a lot of work around race and internationalism, and so we became close. And I would occasionally go up to New York and just kind of hang out. Which was always interesting. We would go to cafes or restaurants, and The women would just come, to be honest. We would sit there and just parade after some stranger would come over. And he was always gracious. And it was great. He taught me how to eat bread at a restaurant, get a little plate and put some oil and some pepper, and then, but politically, we were also kind of, engaging. There was a trip that we took to the UK. And James and his lovely wife Miriam was on there. Harry was there with his wife. A couple of us from Trans-Africa, and we went to the opening of the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool. But Harry also wanted to meet some activists, and I had lived in the UK for a number of years, so we organized a visit to London, where we pulled together some of the Afro British activists. And it was a great meeting. There can contest, people were just awed to be in his presence. And it wasn't a superficial meeting. It was really a discussion about, race and the politics of the UK. So, I considered Harry to be a friend. And, but beyond that, just his impact over, 50, 60, 70 years, it's just immeasurable. And I really recommend that people read his book, his biography, My Song, where he details just this rich life that he led.
Yes, his life really was multi-layered, multifaceted. He just seemed to jump from one thing to the other with such ease. And I wonder whether the fact that he brought Calypso to America, so to speak, or put Calypso on the map. Let's start with that. Many Calypsonians today say that they're grateful that he made people aware of Calypso.
It was kind of amazing that his album Calypso was like the first million seller album in America. I mean, I just find that amazing. Now, I know there was some controversy because I think they dubbed him the Calypso King, but the fact was in Trinidad, I think some people resented that because, right. And I think even Harry might not have been so appreciative of that, but back in those days and that time, we didn't know the details, but the songs, were like workers' songs, the people songs, the folk songs that he brought to us. And like I said, I was not even aware of Caribbean music, but it touched me deeply, even though I didn't know it and I didn't know these were my brothers and sisters. It raised our consciousness about the diaspora. Yeah. But that this was the first million-selling record in America, that is like overwhelming.
And
well, the first million-selling record, and the fact that he sociologically associated himself with base community working people who worked from can to can. Daylight come and I want to go home.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
So he really grounded himself with everyday, ordinary people. And that record, beyond its aesthetic power, is really a sociological reading that he carried through the rest of his life, wherever he went. His relationship to Union 1199, his relationship to the anti-apartheid movement. I met Aristide with him in South Africa. He and I spent almost 11 days together speaking in South Africa at an Arts and Culture International gathering. And one day he invited me to lunch. He says, I have somebody I want you to meet. And it was President Aristide, who had been exiled by Colin Powell, and President Barack Obama did not want him to return to the Caribbean. So that record really set his social moral ethic, and he never let his vertical profile, his global fan base, take him away from being grounded in everyday community. And I think, in addition to the $1 Million Index, which was quite significant, as Dear has pointed out, that was a ideological grounding with ordinary people. And their vantage points, their own sense of narrative that comes through in that Calypso album, and particularly the song Deo.
I thought it was interesting that he did choose to associate himself with that, with the words of that song, written by a Barbadian. Many of those songs in that record. It also made it clear to me that there was some connection between some benefit to his mother taking him back to the Caribbean. And he connected that. He managed to make that connection very well. But that life between here and the Caribbean.
Well, in an interview I did with him in 2007 for the Pacifica WPFW network here in Washington, D.C., called Descent Towards Democracy, on how Harry Belafonte became a patriot in the 20th and 21st century. He talked about moving around among family members in the Caribbean. So the sort of social picture that was painted was that he was always connected to the Black community and fragments of that community, but he was also very much connected to his, I think, Irish grandmother. His grandmother was white, and culturally he was a part of the African diaspora, but he always avowed this multiracial character. And I think it was reflected in his ecumenical approach to the world. He had a big fan base in places like Germany. I know that he and Clarence Hussein had exchanges about Afro-Europeans. And when you look at his stature in Europe, he was huge in Western Europe, not just among Black Americans and among Caribbeans. Huge in Latin America and Africa, and always striving to find those voices that were emerging from community, like Miriam Makeba coming out of South Africa, like Hugh Masekela, right up to the present day, as Dira alluded to, people like Common, who related very, very close to him, and a number of other contemporary singers who related to him, not just in terms of his aesthetic, but in terms of his outlook and his social justice posture, which was uncompromising.
Absolutely. Professor
Yeah,
Lucien, you were going to say
yes.
something?
Yeah, just a couple points. So as Dara points out, he was grounded by the Caribbean in those ties. Because he talks about when he was younger, he was basically kind of a wild kid. And so his mother was like, this ain't gonna work here in the Bronx. So, she took him back and forth. And then he begins to get really grounded. And then he comes back to New York, and then he's really grounded as New York is emerging with Malcolm X, and then the Civil Rights Movement is emerging. And so he's starting to look at that. He becomes active around the case of W.B. Du Bois. Du Bois had his passport taken. Harry found, understood that and did some fundraisers. And then, as either James or Adira mentioned, then Paul Robeson, and he talks about, he modeled his life very much after looking at Paul Robeson and, what he kind of, the principles that he stood on. And, for me, it was really, really inspirational and really kind of a guiding light, because at one point he said, and he wrote about in his book, that he was an activist that became an artist.
Right.
And, and I've seen myself as an activist who became an academic, not kind of the other way around. And that was really Harry.
Yeah, maybe those early days when he was kind of a wild kid, there was the activism there. The seeds of activism might have been sowed somewhere there.
And what was interesting too is that unlike many names we can remember from the 50s and 60s and civil rights, his activism grew. It grew, and it really got more established and got more Pan-African. He is connected with Kenya and South Africa and Rwanda, and another artist he brought up was Odetta. I really admired him for bringing African women to the front. Not a lot of Black artists had the knowledge or the space to do that. You often saw white artists bringing and introducing Black artists to the American scene. And Harry did this for our sisters, especially Odetta and Miriam. And this was just so honorable. He was just a man of character. He had a solid conscience. I wish all artists were like Harry Belafonte. He gave money to the struggle. He supported it in so many ways. I think he supported SNCC. He supported the Martin Luther King family, even though they kind of fell out, I think, in the past few years over some documents, but that was, I guess, resolved. But he was just very supportive of Martin Luther King and stood beside him and was in the front line. I mean, he made relationships with people from Eleanor Roosevelt, Frank Sinatra, all the way to all like Paul Robeson, the top activists and conscious people. He was friends with Fidel Castro and Chavez. I mean, this touches my heart. It means so much, and I wish there were many more who would learn about him, read his story, and follow in his footsteps. Because this, we never need to rest. We need to always be on the move and build. And I think this was part of his philosophy as well. And I think probably for as long as he could think and breathe, he was thinking of fighting the system and fighting against injustice, and in many ways against white supremacy.
And in line with what Dear has mentioned, particularly with regard to women and Black women in particular, he took Sweet Honey in the Rock to Cuba. One of the things that I recognized when I first visited him at his West End apartment, a building that he had bought when they refused to rent to him, and he talked to Eleanor Roosevelt, so he went and bought the whole building and invited other Black artists to live there. One of the things about his apartment was that I saw these letters from Martin Luther King framed on the wall. And these were not, simple 1 or 2 paragraphs, Dear Harry, thank you for raising money letters. They reflected that there was really, that Harry Belafonte was a part of the strategic, philosophical and practical operational thinking in the civil rights movement. He was not just a showpiece using his artistic stature to simply help finance the movement. He was always on the lookout for where the new voices were coming. In the case of hip hop, Beat Street, which was one of the very early documentaries about hip hop, about Black and Latino young people on the streets of New York City, emerging with this new genre. Harry Belafonte was right there. On one occasion, at the Hotel Nacional in Cuba, in that beautiful plaza that overlooks the Malecon, he was sitting talking to some folk, and he said he kept looking up and saw these 3 Black guys with dreads looking at him. And after his meeting, he walked over and introduced himself. He thought they were Jamaican, and they were actually Black Cubans. And he said, so what do you guys do? And they said, we're into rap. And he says, what do you rap about? And they said, racism and the police. It just so happened that that day that Mr. B was having lunch with his dear old friend, the president of the country, Fidel Castro, and Abel Prieto, who's the Minister of Culture, accompanied him. And I've talked to Mr. B about this, and he said he walked in and Fidel said, hello, Harry, what you been up to? And Mr. B responded, I think I'm getting into your business. And it was Mr. B who talked to Fidel Castro about hip hop and rap. And one can imagine that Fidel Castro did not have a clue about what he was talking about. Well, 6 months later, because of his respect for Harry Belafonte, his analytical views, his ability to see the emerging voices and emerging genres, the Cubans had set up a rap agency within the Ministry of Culture and had opened up a recording line in their recording companies for hip hop. And it's documented. I attended a meeting, Danny Glover and I, with him 6 months later, with about 30 Black rappers in Cuba. And they have written about that, documenting that Mr. Belafonte was the interlocutor to introduce the hip hoppers, the rappers in Cuba, and groups like Obsession in Cuba today still talk very much in praise about his contribution.
We did, James and I were down there one point in Cuba, and we met some of these rappers. And they had a thriving, very broad rap hip hop community that developed within a very short period and began to, in my estimation, move past where some of the limits were on rap in the U.S. in terms of a broader kind of internationalist perspective, how they were dealing with issues around gender. And that was really out of Harry's discussions and his perception of always looking for the new and looking for and not being stuck in the old. Because here, when that was occurring, it was still pretty much, at least for the Black Civil Rights Movement, older Black activists, hip hop was still seen as kind of an alien, well, maybe not alien, but certainly, we don't have anything to kind of do with that. And, Harry's was one of the people who really kind of perceived the power that came from young people articulating in their music form, what they were facing.
He always seemed to be on the cutting edge. He always seemed to know what was coming next. He obviously was vigilant, constantly vigilant for issues that he could address. What do you think was responsible for the ease with which he was able to maneuver from the top levels of the Roosevelts to hip hop? He was able to seem to be at ease wherever he happened to be. Is that strength of character? Is that his boldness? What was that?
I would say strength of character. I think that's a good entree to looking at his interior strength. Mr. Belafonte was a very confident and transparent person about his feelings, his human frailties, and about his sense of strength, and also his good looks. I mean, he knew that he was a handsome brother who had the power of attraction. Harry was also dyslexic. In the interview that I did with him in 1970, and he wrote about it in other places, he talked about his difficulty in reading and how letters would turn around on him. But he was the most eloquent, poetic speaker that one could ever imagine. I mean, he could stand and deliver. And so that he found other avenues of coding the world and interpreting the world in his orality. But he talked about this limitation that he had. He talked about being in the military around guys who were reading W.E.B. Du Bois and other great African-American writers, and how out of it he felt. And so that he went to the library and forced his way into getting them to give him, these segregated libraries, to give him books such that he could empower himself and stretch his imagination. And I think it's very important because he was such a moral force, he was such an artistic force that the mainstream, while acknowledging him, wants to circumscribe him within the current ideological, political, and economic system. But Mr. Belafonte went well beyond speaking truth to power. He was someone who was always looking at where are the new radical possibilities for human existence. And he was very open in talking about his association with the Cuban Revolution. He was very open in talking about his hopes for the revolutionary Bolivarian process. Hugo Chavez, who was an extraordinarily energetic and organic intellectual, always full of verbal engagement, went silent and just listened for an extended period of time to Mr. B, who laid out what had been going on in the world in the anti-apartheid movement with Amilcar Cabral, in Capo Verde and other Portuguese colonies in Africa fighting against colonialism. So he is someone to be seen looking always beyond the boundaries, always looking for new possibilities and challenging the status quo. And the mainstream press tends to back away from that or to circumscribe him as someone who was simply hanging out with quote unquote dictators because they are fearful. Like in the case of Jesse Jackson, they were fearful of asking Jesse Jackson questions because he would always come back with an angle, a perspective, a transformative perspective that the status quo was not really ready for. And I think that's a lesson that he leaves. He was always looking for these new young voices who are on the cutting edge, not just of integrating. He liked to say that Martin Luther King said in his later days, I think we're integrating a burning house. They were always looking at how to construct a new house, not just integrate the old system.
And Dira?
Well, I just think, from all I've read about him, he just had his pulse on the movement. He had his eyes on the prize. He, like James and Clarence have said, he never stopped fighting, and that was part of his philosophy. So he found, the new speakers, the new activists. He found everything. He worked, and I think he had a lot to do with Mandela's visit to the United States. He had his finger on every pulse, every movement. I think even one time he was the head of a gay pride march in New York. I mean, everything that was progressive, he inserted himself. And I think he did it. I mean, the way he did it, he was just a smooth operator. I mean, he could sing, he could act, he could speak. He had this amazing voice that made you just listen to him. And he had charisma. And he just, like James explained, he used it wisely, but he also used it strategically to build the right alliances and to be in the right places at the right time, even though it was not popular. It's hard to believe that this man we're talking about, so eloquent, so outstanding. I was reading where, he was, I think, on a TV program with Petula Clark, and she touched his arm and they threatened not to show the film. I mean, how does this happen that he was refused at restaurants? He suffered from the same system. We think that someone like him would be exempt from this, but he suffered it, he knew it. And no matter how high he rose or how great he might have been in the eyes of the public, he had the common touch. He was a king with a common touch. And that is like one of the most admirable attributes you can have. And he was wise.
Yeah, he could walk among kings as well as peasants. Yeah. And he was always ready to challenge the status quo.
Right. Like Stokely used to say, ready for the revolution. He always was.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he had undying love for his people as well. That was obvious.
And he would call you out. He called out Colin Powell.
Right.
Oh,
exactly.
yeah. I was
he called out
that.
Barack Obama.
Condoleezza Rice.
Yeah.
He called out George Bush, called him the greatest terrorist in the world, and he did not back off
That's the thing.
of the evils and the limitations of the system. And he was always pushing people to make the rhetoric of democracy a reality and not just to inhibit and inhabit the rhetorical shadows of that. And so he spared no one when it came to the issue of principle and called out those contradictions and was able to do it in the center of the public space, not just from the margins. And that's what made him such a socially powerful individual, that he situated himself right in the center of gravity where ideological and political contestations were going on, and he did not shy away from that. And the state, the FBI was investigating him. They had relationships with his psychiatrist, so they were surveilling him throughout. But nevertheless, he had the gift and the courage to figure out how to maintain his balance and be successful in all of his endeavors, particularly his musical and filmic endeavors, and his global organizing. He did not back off of any of the confrontations. And I think he
Yeah.
probably had looked at Paul Robeson and saw how they attacked and undermined Paul Robeson, but drew strength from Paul Robeson's stand. As Clarence Hussein has pointed out, he was always consistently clear that Paul Robeson was the path cutter for him, the man who opened a vision of what possibilities were, particularly using his voice. And he always liked to say, Paul Robeson said to him, "Don't worry, Harry, get him to sing your song, and that will open up pathways." And such it was that we all were singing Deo, and we
Yeah, he
recognized
mints
that
no
Deo was
words.
well beyond the musical event, but it really opened all kinds of social justice fronts, as both Dira and Clarence have laid out.
Yeah, that's true. He minced no words. He had great courage. Professor Lucien, you were about to say something earlier.
I was just going to for the fearlessness, and as James pointed out, and he did it knowing that there could be costs. So, for example, when he criticized George W. Bush, one consequence of that was when Coretta Scott King died, there became an issue about whether he would be at the funeral along with the Bushes. And the King family basically backed down and basically kind of disinvited him. Now, this is after he had literally financed these kids, the King kids, back during the day. But, you know, he did not back off of at all. And when Barack Obama was elected, he was a critical voice and said that, you know, it's got to be more than just sort of, you know, shiny. And so at one point, he was in a space with Barack Obama, and Obama came over and said, you know, Harry, you know, can you cut me some slack? And his response was, "What makes you think we haven't?" Right? Because like you just don't, you know, we haven't gave you the full blast, but you know, if you continue down this road, you know, that's where we're headed. So he did not back off at all, you know, in the spirit of, you know, Fannie Lou Hamer and others, you know, it was just no backing down. So I think that's just really kind of critical to understand. The other thing I remember him talking about is he also was aware of the cost to Paul Robeson and the financial costs, the emotional costs that, you know, late in life, you know, Paul Robeson was basically broken by the U.S.
Yeah.
And, you know, he understood that as well, that, you know, can also be a cost that, you know, activists pay, but you got to stand on principle.
Yes, the one thing that stands out when I talk everything you read about him, everybody you talk to about him, the one thing that stands out is that strength of character and his willingness to, so in many ways, to gamble whatever it took to stand to stand his ground or to stand on his principle. He was prepared to take whatever came his way once he was able to be clear that he was
Yes.
going to stand on his principle and not back down. And that's something that I think is most admirable about him. Most people seem to point to that. On the global perspective, when we look at the global picture, let's look at what his legacy. What would we say? He's had so many layers and impacted so many different people. How can we summarize what his legacy might be?
He was an internationalist, and you know, you can't really go anywhere in the world where, you know, his voice has not been raised in some of the struggles that we've seen, whether it was in Ireland, whether it was in Palestine, whether it was in Brazil, whether it was in all over Africa, throughout the Caribbean, Asia. And so that really, I think, is a model for, as we talk about, you know, that it's really a global fight. And it isn't just one country or one movement, but it really is kind of the intersecting dynamics. And he understood that, he lived that, his activism kind of reflected that, my colleagues have been saying.
I think Clarence classifies it quite accurately that he was an internationalist. He was a citizen in the United States with responsibilities and obligations, but he also positioned himself as a citizen of the world with responsibilities and obligations. And again, a key part of that was looking at who were the emerging voices, where were the new voices of transformative struggle, of critical perspectives of new possibilities emerging. And again, looking into South Africa with Hugh Masekela and Mary Makeba and other artists, he was right there. I remember him sitting with Hugo Chavez and giving a panoramic view of the world. And when he said something poetically like, "Here I am in the winter of my life," after having communicated with Mandela and been on a battlefront where Amilcar Cabral was fighting, and he referenced a number, Fidel Castro, and then he says, "And here you come along." And so he's looking at a young Hugo Chavez and really giving him a sense of a world-connected struggle in which Harry had been on the front lines experientially, not just from a point of view of reading. And so that the Palestinian issue, particularly the Cuban issue, he and Fidel Castro were very, very close friends. I had occasion on at least 2 occasions to be in Cuba with him and his former wife, in which they had house parties, and great Latin American writers, Gabriel Marquez and others, would come around. He was magnetic in that way because people saw the moral character. We would arrive in Cuba for the film festival or other events, and the Ministry of Culture would call a meeting and bring all of the Black Cubans around, and they would want Harry and Danny and myself to talk about issues of race. And I remember him being very frustrated at the end of one of those meetings, and where he said something to the effect, quote, "You people still don't get it." He was really, really pushing, although he was a strong supporter of the Cuban Revolution. He made no compromise about looking at contradictions and errors or failures, while he was willing to acknowledge the radical development in their uplift in education and healthcare and the like. He was not into fanfare. He was into a steely-eyed look at the global world and took on all. But his strength didn't just go out of his individualism. I think it's really important to realize, and as Clarence has pointed out, he was somewhat of a delinquent youth, that he had a delinquent youth that he talked about with the number of runners and whatnot. And his history as a child in Jamaica, being in a working class situation where he was moving from household to household, those memories and that grounding never left him. And that was the basis for him going out into the world, not just being an individual figure, but always being socially grounded.
Yeah. Dira, in the idea of his impact on musicians in America, what would you say?
Oh, I think it's immeasurable, and I'm glad that James mentioned and Clarence mentioned the whole hip hop connection, because many hip hop artists actually sampled some of his work, but also stood up with him. I think that his legacy. He was just a great humanist. He had the common touch. He stood up for the working class. I think when any of us read his story, there were so many levels that he touched on and stood for, and represented us the way we could not represent ourselves. A giant among men. What he did for music from the early days, I know in his later life, music was not so much a part of his presence as his political activism, which underlines what he said in the beginning, that he was an activist who also was an artist, but an activist first. So I think his life can be an example for many of us. It can be an inspiration that we can never get tired because this is a vicious animal we're fighting around the world, everywhere. We see the devil is raging everywhere. And, you know, there's no time to sit back and wait and hope. We can see what's going on. The truth is out. We are woke and we need to
Yeah.
stay woke, and we need to definitely look at Mr. B's example and follow it. And we can't all be exactly like him, but we can make a contribution. We can stand up, we can be conscious, we can read, we can be aware, we can unite with our brothers and sisters around the world, of all races and everyone. First and foremost, we want to build Africa, but that's so we can join hands with everybody. So I think that Harry will always, as long as we call his name, he will be an example for many of us.
Yeah, and he was very impatient with other artists who did not use their position
Right.
to stand up for certain things along the way. So
Very, very
he was not
important.
afraid to call them out.
Artists
Yeah.
are very important because they have the attention of the people. So to waste that attention, that time, we're in trouble. We're in trouble, and we need to be educated, and we need to be lifted, and we need to be inspired, and we need to know our history. And so if you can do that through music, then you're making a real we need a party, we need a dance, that's cool. But somewhere along the line, you've got to make a commitment and stand up for who you are and what you are and where we're going and what is correct. And if you don't, every time, we're going to lose something. So I hope everybody's listening. I hope everybody's paying attention. Again, his life will be a great example for all of us.
Yeah. I did have one encounter with him. I attended a conference in St. Martin where he has a home. And I was new, fairly young new, I shouldn't say young, but new at Voice of America. And I had just got this talk show, my own talk show at Voice of America. So I was more interested in getting him on the talk show and really not astute enough to pay attention to the politics behind inviting him to appear in the Voice of America.
Right.
And
Right.
the seething look that he gave me when
That's funny.
I think had I not been a Caribbean person, he would probably have told me off. But because I guess he had pity on me, and he just seethed and that squinted his eyes and looked at me, and he gave me the number, but I knew it was not going to come to anything, and I think he just bit his tongue rather than say what he wanted to say. But I got it. As a matter of fact, I listened to his speech following that. His speech was coming up in that event. And once I listened to his speech, I knew exactly that there was no way he was going to be coming on to talk on Voice of America. He was really at war with the government. So, any closing remarks from any of you? Professor Lucet?
Well, I think Dara in her last 2 or 3 comments, points us in the right direction. It's not enough sufficient for us just to know about the history and the contributions of Harry Belafonte, but what are we going to do? What is this generation going to do of picking up those values, picking up that posture, picking up those global connections, and not just speaking truth to power, but envisioning themselves of becoming the power. And I think this is what the ultimate grounding of Mr. Belafonte was about, and his connection to the Cuban Revolution, in particular, the anti-apartheid movement with the African National Congress, and his initial relationship with the Bolivarian Revolution led then by Hugo Chavez was, he said openly, I am always going to associate myself with people who are committed to new human possibilities. He did not spare them criticism for errors or stupidities, but he did unite with them on the possibilities of envisioning and creating a new world, a new humanity. And I think that is what we have to take forth if we really, really respect and want to honor his historical contributions. That's the grounding that he left for us to look forward and to move forward.
Professor Lucet, you want to add anything?
I mean, James, I think says it all. Someone who, 70, 80 years of his life, he really dedicated to bringing about change. And, as long as you can, as you can, that's what we all can do. And up until, this year, he spoke in favor, with Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, wasn't, didn't stop, 10, 15 years ago, he kind of continued on. And so, we can embrace that and celebrate him for that as we incorporate that into, as James and Dira talk about, our continually to build our movements.
Well, that's the charge. An example to follow. Harry Belafonte, a multi-talented, multifaceted man of unwavering integrity, whose passion for justice directed his paths. Thank you all for joining me today in Carib Nation. Professor Clarence Lucene, PhD, Dira Tompkins, and James Early. And thanks to you, our audience, for watching. Remember, our motto in Carib Nation is one people, one culture, one Caribbean, one nation. Until next time, I'm Dara Steve.